In our previous shiur, we concluded with the Mishnah at the bottom of Daf Yud Amid Beis. We saw a series of different expressions that resulted in a vow, in a binding vow. The Gemara opens up with a topic heading that we have included on the side. You can see where the word nosei is written in. We've included Moni Masnisen, according to whom is our Mishnah. The Sover, the Mishnah is of the opinion, D'amrina Michlal Lav Ata Shomea Hein, that one infers, that from the negative one can infer the positive. Ukitikotoni, as our Mishnah taught, Lachulin Sha'ocheloch, if a person says Lachulin Sha'ocheloch, then the result is Ozer. It's a binding vow. Demashma, the expression Lachulin Sha'ocheloch implies that Lo Chulin Leheve, that which I would give to you is not to be viewed as Chulin, Elo Korban Ma Sha'ocheloch. That which you would be getting from me would be korban. Korban is the origin of vows, and a korban is that which you make forbidden. So what this person is actually saying is the food that you would be taking from me is forbidden unto you. But how did we get to that conclusion? By inferring from the expression, namely, that which I will feed you is not chulin. Chulin is the mundane, and the opposite of that is that which is holy, and that which is holy is forbidden. So from the expression that's stated in the negative, I infer the positive, namely, not chulin is what you will be getting from me, but rather, yes, kodshim. Kodshim is that which has been sanctified and hence also. And our Mishnah said that is a binding vow. So now our Gemara opens with a question. We've noted that the question is a long question. There's a sort of a give and take within this section of Gemara, but more than halfway down this Omid, the question comes to a climax. Savruha, we are making an assumption, and the word savruha, generally speaking, would be an assumption that's rejected, but in this case, it represents an assumption that will stick. And the Meforshim point out that you have another instance of a savruha being an assumption that remains in the first daf of Maseches Bava Basra. So here the Gemara says savruha, my lachulin, the expression lachulin she'ochelach that we saw in the Mishnah means loy lechulin leheve. We saw the Meforshim in our previous shiur that vowelized the lamed with a patach, lachulin, and that vowelization enables us to understand the word lachulin as not chulin. Not chulin shall be ella korban, and now that's an inference. Not chulin, but yes korban. Bear in mind, the speaker didn't say that which I give to you will be a korban, but he spoke in the negative. That which I will give to you will be non-chulin, from which we infer, but yes korban, and that is binding. And that means that we can take expressions and draw the inference from them, and that inference will be binding. Moni Masnisen, according to whom is our Mishnah. Rabbi Meir, if you were to think to ascribe authorship to Rabbi Meir, that can't be, because les le michlal lav ata shomea hein. Rabbi Meir says, basically, and if we put it in broad terms, things must be spelled out. You cannot leave people to draw conclusions through inferences. Disnan, and here we see a mocker for that, a source for that. Rabbi Meir Omer called Tnai she'eno ketnai b'nei Gad u'b'nei Ruvain eno Tnai. Any condition that is not spelled out in both the positive terms and the negative terms is not a binding condition. And the reference that you see in the Gemara to the Bnei Gad, Bnei Ruvain, that's a historical reference to the tribes of Gad and Ruvain, that when in the time of Moshe Rabbeinu they insisted on remaining on the eastern side of the Jordan River and not and seemingly not participating in the conquest of the land of Israel on the western bank of the Jordan River. So Moshe Rabbeinu, we'll say, made a deal with them, or they made a deal with Moshe Rabbeinu, where Moshe Rabbeinu spelled out the conditions. And he says that if you will come and fight with us in conquering the land, so then you will get that which you desire. And if you will not come and fight with us, then you will not get that which you desire. So everything was spelled out, the positive and the negative. And we didn't leave it, it wasn't left to them to infer that if you come and fight with us, you will get what you want. And then it stands to reason that if we don't come and fight, then we won't get what we want. No, it wasn't like that. But rather, everything was spelled out. So Rabbi Meir does not hold from Michlal Lav Atashamahen, that from inferring from the negative you can conclude the positive. Well, but our Mishnah says you can. Ella Rabbi Yehuda he. So we'll have to assume then that our Mishnah is in accordance with Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda is the known bar plukta of the opinion of Rabbi Meir. Well, Amos Seifa. Let's continue then in the reading of our Mishnah. It said, and here's again a quote from the Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Omer Yushalayim Lo Omar Klum. If a person says that an item is Yerushalayim, that's not a vow, it's meaningless. Midaseifa Rabbi Yehuda, then it stands to reason that if Rabbi Yehuda is the author of the end of the Mishnah, Reisha Lav Rabbi Yehuda, the Reisha, which is what we're focusing right now on, the Lahulin Sha'ichalach part of the Mishnah, the beginning of the Mishnah, is not Rabbi Yehuda. You see that he speaks up, his Shlita is referred to only at the end of the Mishnah, but the beginning, that's not Rabbi Yehuda. The Gemara answers, and you'll see we have a double underline to highlight the expression Kula Rabbi Yehuda he. You see that over here, and you'll see it again later. The Gemara responds and says Kula Rabbi Yehuda he. The entire Mishnah is really authored by Rabbi Yehuda. The Hachi Katani, and the end of the Mishnah should be understood as follows: She Rabbi Yehuda Omer Ha'omer Yerushalayim Lo Omar Klum. The Rashi explains. We're looking together at the Rashi on the third line under the Gemara text. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Ha'omer Yerushalayim v'chulei deboina shemar kit Yerushalayim. In order for the vow to take hold, it's expected that you will say the word Yerushalayim, but with a prefix chaf. Klomar ke korbonos she b'Yerushalayim. If you say that you want something to be binding, and you say I want this, let's say this item to be Yerushalayim, that's nothing, because in order for a vow to be binding in the use of the term Yerushalayim, you would have to say Ki Yerushalayim. So that the Mishnah is in fact completely authored by Rabbi Yehuda, who at this point in time also represents the opinion that says you can draw inferences from that which is stated in the negative and discover what the positive is, even though the positive was not spelled out. The Gemara asks, V'ha Tanya, but do we not have a Tanaic source that says Rabbi Yehuda Omer Ha'omer kit Yerushalayim Lo Omar Klum Ad Shiyoda B'Dover HaKorev B'Yerushalayim, that even with this, we'll call it this improved version, namely one who says that I want this item to be Ki Yerushalayim, it's meaningless. So we see that you can't explain Rabbi Yehuda of the Seifa as trying to teach that point, when you see that here explicitly he doesn't hold from that. And when until what point is a neder then going to be binding? Means until you vow comparing the item that you want to prohibit to be compared to something that's offered within Yerushalayim, like animal offerings or meal offerings that are offered on the altar that's found in the holy temple in Yerushalayim. So it's not reasonable then to say that the Reisha of the Mishnah is going to be in accordance with Rabbi Yehuda, when Rabbi Yehuda is the author of the Seif of the Mishnah, and the answer we try to give that the entire Mishnah is in accordance with Yehuda, and understand it as we suggested before, that falls away. The Gemara responds once again and says, Kula Rabbi Yehuda. The entire Mishnah is in accordance with Rabbi Yehuda. Utrei Tanoi Aliba Rabbi Yehuda. And there are two opinions as to what Rabbi Yehuda holds with regard to a vow using the term Ki Yerushalayim. So that, just to review the main point, our Mishnah that said La Chulin Sha'oichalach is a binding vow is a result of Michlal Lav Atoshamehain, because La Chulin Sha'oichalach really means not Chulin is that which you will be getting from me. So not Chulin, but rather, and here's the inference, but rather, yes, Korbanos is what you are getting from me. And that's another way of saying that which you get from me shall be unto you like a korban, like a sacrifice. And in simple terms, that which you are getting from me is forbidden to you. So one opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, though, with regard to the Yerushalayim issue is that by saying Ki Yerushalayim, that is an effective vow. And then there's a second opinion as to what Rabbi Yehuda holds on that topic, namely that by saying even saying Ki Yerushalayim, that is not effective until you're more specific and say that the item you're trying to prevent, you're trying to prohibit, shall be like something offered in Yerushalayim, but not merely comparing it to Yerushalayim. The Gemara continues at the top of Omid Beis, Tanya. And we have a Tanaic source that has a number of different phrases. On the side of the Gemara, you see the word nosei, a topic heading. Nisayon, and we've written on the side, Nisayon shal Gemara lahamid braisik Rabbi Meir. We're going to see a Tanaic source, and the Gemara's subsequent attempt to set up the source like Rabbi Meir, the sover lo amrinon michlalav ato shomei ahein, that we do not leave you to draw conclusions through inference type logic, but rather, if something is going to take hold, it would have to be spelled out. So now let's see the source. Chulin, ha-chulin, ke-chulin. Person uses any of these words. Chulin meaning something that's mundane or common. Bein she'ochal loch, bein she'lo ochal loch, mutter. Meaning there's no vow. So if a person were to say chulin lo ochaloch, that is not a binding vow. La chulin she'ochaloch Ozer. La chulin lo ochaloch mutter. So if a person says la chulin, or there's another girsa that says lo chulin she'ochaloch, that is binding. However, if you say lo chulin lo ochaloch, that's not binding. Now, the Gemara will go over this source, trying to figure out the authorship. Reisha Moni. The Reisha is in accordance with whom? Rabbi Meir he. The less lay, Rabbi Meir, denies the idea of Michlal Lav Ato Shomei Ahein, that through the inference drawn from the negative, you can conclude the positive. So let's just check that out. Our Mishnah, this Tanaic source, that is, mentioned amongst other things, if a person were to say, Chulin lo ochel loch. So chulin I will not be providing you with. In other words, my food unto you is not chulin. So that what is it in the positive? It would be a korban. And yet the source says that a phrase like that of chulin lo ochelach, where you could infer a term that would lead to prohibition, yet it doesn't work. It's ineffective. And that was what this source said in the middle of the line, the word mutar. It's not binding. That reflects an opinion that says we don't say mechlal avat hashemen. That's Rabbi Meir. Just to remind ourselves, Rabbi Meir was the author of the Tanai God and Tanai B'nai God B'nai Ruvain, where things had to be spelled out, the positive and the negative. Otherwise, it's not binding. Eimal Seifa. And we now present a question. Notice it takes a number of lines to develop. So let's continue with the Seifa. It said in the Seifa of this source, L'chulin lo ochaloch mutter. That was the final example of the source. That if a person says L'chulin lo ochaloch, the vow is not binding. But do we not have a source that says L'korban lo ochaloch? Rabbi Meir Ozer, if a person were to phrase his vow using that expression, namely L'korban lo ochaloch, Rabbi Meir says that the vow is binding. The kashiolon, and we ask on that, why is that binding? Let's analyze that phrase. He says L'korban lo ochaloch. So and now la korban, it will assume, like we've said before, that if you vowelize it with a patach, it's like saying la korban is like not korban, I will not be giving you. So a non-korban is that which I will not be giving you, inferring that which you would be getting from me is a korban. That's an inference. That's michlal lav atashmein. From the negative, we infer the positive. And the positive the inference then comes out that the food that you would be receiving to me shall be unto you like a korban. And Rabbi Meir says it's binding. But isn't that a problem? Because in order to come to that conclusion, we have to draw an inference. The Gemara continues, the Omar Rabbi Abba. Rabbi Abba explains that when he said L'korban lo ochaloch, it's not simply an inference, but rather nase ke'omer. It's rather as if the person is saying L'korban yehei lefikach lo ochaloch. Now notice how we add in this lefikach lo ochaloch. So if a person says L'korban lo ochaloch, it's not like we thought before, but if you want to understand why that's Ozer, is because by saying L'korban lo ochaloch, it's like saying that L'korban yehei, the food that I have with respect to you shall be like a korban, and therefore you won't be able to eat from it. So you see that we will say we doctor up the phrase, we add a certain type of understanding to the phrase, and then come to a conclusion. So hacha nami, so too with regard to someone who says lo chulin lo ochaloch, as we saw at the end of the source, 3 lines from the top, where it said la chulin lo ochaloch, and we explained that la chulin is like saying not chulin lo ochaloch. So why couldn't that be explained the same way as Rabbi Abba did and say Hochi ka'amar, what the fellow is saying is lo chulin lehevei lefikach lo ochaloch. That which you would be receiving from me is not chulin, it's not mundane, and therefore you cannot eat from it. And I'm sure you're noting that this approach of saying lo chulin lehevei, not chulin it shall be, namely the food that I provide, lefikach lo ochaloch, and therefore since it's not chulin, you will not be able to eat from it. That is direct prohibition. That's not inference drawing. So that if you're going to suggest that the source above is going to be like Rebbe Meir, then why does the end of the source, which said lo chulin lo ochaloch, why does the end of the source result in it saying mutter, and we don't adopt Rebbe Abba's approach? The Gemara answers, Hi Tana, Sovar lo k'Rebbe Meir b'chada, upolig olei b'chada. The brisa at the top that you see in the frame in which you saw l'chulin l'ochalach, and that resulting in a non-vow, that is because he holds like Rebbe Meir with regard to one aspect of things and disagrees with him with regard to another. And the Gemara spells that out. Savar lo kavose b'chada, the author of the top source agrees with Rebbe Meir on one point, the less lay michlal lav atashomehin. He does not accept inference drawing. And therefore, when you saw at the opening of the source, you saw lechulin lo ochaloch, not chulin, I will not be giving you, and you might have inferred, but korban, which represents prohibition, is what you would be getting from me. That's why the source says it doesn't take hold, because in order to get to conclude a prohibition, you would have to use inference logic. So on that score, the unnamed anonymous Tanaic source at the top is like Rebbe Meir, upolig olei b'chada b'korban, but he disagrees with Rebbe Meir with regard to the word b'korban is very terse, but it's a reference to Rabbi Abba's approach to the Tanaic source, which read lekorban lo'ochalach Rabbi Meir Ozer, and in order to understand that, you had to add in the lekorban yehei lefikach lo'ochalach understanding of Rabbi Abba. Well, the top source doesn't agree with that approach. Therefore, according to the top Tana, Rashi points out that if a person would have said lo korban or la korban lo ochalach, Rabbi Meir would have ruled mutter, because in order to get to a statement of prohibition, you would have to infer, and we don't accept inference logic. Rav Ashi Omar. Rav Ashi has a different approach, and that's why we're calling him a point number 2. Ha di Omar lechulin, the ha di Omar lo lechulin. The approach we're taking here is not like we said before. Before, we were assuming that when you see la chulin, it is like saying lo chulin. Rav Ashi says, don't understand things like that. And we take a look at the Rashi explanation in the middle of the wide lines. Ha diamar lechulin, diamar lechulin lo'ochaloch, have mutter. If a person were to say lechulin lo'ochalach, that would be mutter. Afagav de mashma, even though it sounds like he's saying ma sha'ochal, that which I will give you, have a korban. So why is that mutter? Because the less le michlal avata shemehin kidprecious liel. Rabbi Meir doesn't accept inference type logic, as we explained earlier. Uli inyan hai terutza de metartzinon liel lo lechulin lehevei v'chulei hanimili heicha diomar loi lechulin. As far as what Rabbi Abba explained before, that not chulin shall it be, therefore you won't be able to eat from it. That's because he spelled out the expression lo chulin, and that's what Rashi points out here. Hani mili heicha diomar loi lechulin, avol lechulin lo mashma loi lechulin. So you're dealing with a very, very fine difference in speech, and it makes all of the difference. If a person says lichulin lo'ochaloch, that will not be binding, because in order to come to a statement of prohibition, you would have to draw an inference. However, if he says lo chulin, not lechulin, but lo, two separate words, lo chulin, then that leaves room for the explanation that Rabbi Abba gave before. Hence, it would be an actual straightforward vow, not inference drawing. So just reading Rav Ashi again. Rav Ashi Amar Ha Di Amar Lichulin. That is what we saw in the top source, where if a person says chulin or lichulin Actually, let me be a little more precise on the third line from the top of the page. L'chulin lo ochalach muter, because in order to come to an expression of prohibition, you would have had to draw an inference. The Omar lo l'chulin. However, the explanation we saw before of l'korban lo ochal Rabbi Meir Ozer, that's the same would apply in the case of chulin if he said lo l'chulin. Demashma lo leheve chulin ela korban. It shall not be chulin, but rather a korban, and therefore you cannot eat from it. The Mishnah mentioned on Daf Yud Omid Beis, tohor, v'tomei, nosar, upigol, oser. The use of any of those expressions, the vow would be binding. Notice we have a long question. Boy Rami Bar Chama. Actually, before we learn the question itself, let's glance at the side. We have a nosei topic heading, and also an indication that this is a long sugya that we're just going to be able to begin and not complete in the context of today's shiur, but it lasts till Yud Gimel Amud Aleph. The nosei, the topic reading, says on the margin, Hamat bis beneder, one who formulates a vow prohibiting an item through comparing it to something else. Haim matbis bi'ikaroi oi behetera. When you are comparing, let us say, an item, if you want to say the standard example is a loaf of bread, to a sacrifice. When you are making that comparison, are you making a reference to the sacrifice in its beginning or in its end? Kagon demunach lefonov basar chulin ubasar shlomim liachar zrika. Another case would be where a person has in front of him some common mundane meat, and meat from a peace offering, from a shlomim sacrifice, after the blood sprinkling was done. And he says, V'yomar zeh kozeh, I want the chulin meat to be like this. What is the person's intention? Now the Gemara. Boy Rami Bar Chama. Harei olai kibasar zivchei shlomim liachar zrikas domim mahu. Here we're just going to translate, because we're going to have to refine this the presentation of the question in another line. But in the meantime, we translate. Person says, I want this to be upon me. And we said before, imagine he had a piece of meat sitting in front of him, and he says, a piece of chulin meat, and he says, I am accepting upon myself this piece of chulin meat to be like shlomim meat after the blood was sprinkled. Now, in all korbanos you'll find, in all animal offerings, you find a blood sprinkling, and most korbanos lend themselves to consumption, to being eaten. I mentioned that as opposed to a korban olah, which is a completely burnt offering, but other korbanos are eaten. And at what point can they be eaten? Not after they're merely slaughtered, but in addition to the slaughtering, there's a sprinkling of the blood, or a blood application on the altar. That's called zrikas domim. So now, if a person said this, and Rami Bar Chama is asking a question, that I'm comparing an item that right now is mutter to a piece of shlomim after the blood was sprinkled. Mahu, what's the din? Well, if a person said exactly that language, there's no question. He's comparing the chulin meat to the korban in its heter state, in its allowed state, and hence there's no vow. If you want to make something Ozer, you want to impose a neder, a prohibition on an item, you'd have to compare it to something that is prohibited, not to something that's allowed. Elo kagoin, rather, what Rami Bar Chama is asking about is a case as follows: the mochis bosar zivchei shlomim kamei. There is, mochis means there is lying in front of him some shlomim meat. Shlomim meat after the blood of that sacrifice was sprinkled. Umochis de teragabei, and there's heter meat in front of him. The Omar, and the person declares zeh kozeh. I want the heter meat to be like this basar shlomim. But that's all he says. We know the circumstances of the meat. The meat is after the blood has been sprinkled. But all the guy says is, he says, I want this currently, this chulin meat to be upon me. I'm accepting it upon myself to be like this, the shlomim. What is the fellow's intention? Is he comparing the chulin meat to the shlomim in its original state, namely before the sprinkling of the blood, or in its allowed state, in other words, as it is now, as it is currently? Hence, at this point then, you see the question, and the Gemara proceeds to suggest a resolution by citing different sources. On the side of the Gemara where the Mivneh note appears, you see a diamond is featured. These are, and if you just skim ahead in the Gemara, if you have Daf Yud Beis in front of you, Daf Yud Beis Amud Aleph, you'll see a continuation of diamonds. And we indicated that this whole topic, though, won't be completed until you get to Daf Yud Gimel Amud Aleph. So these diamonds represent nisyonos livshot hashe'elah, I basar ikoroi oi sofo. When being matfis, when comparing the item that you want to impose with a vow of prohibition, and I compare it to some other item, and we'll just assume that other item also has we'll call it a before and after characteristic. Am I comparing we'll call it the vow-centered item, the item upon which I want to impose a vow of prohibition, am I comparing it to the other item in its original state or in its current state? So Omar Rava, Tashma, Noisar, Upigol. We saw in the Mishnah that if a person uses these expressions, comparing an item, that's what he said, a piece of bread, to nosar or pigol, it's binding. It becomes a vow that's binding. Now, nosar, this maybe we'll try to translate the words. Nosar is leftover sacrificial meat. Pigol is a reference to sacrificial meat that was processed with a wrongful mindset. And if you compare the allowed item to either nosar or pigol, it's considered a vow that takes hold. The Gemara continues at the top of Yud Beis Amud Aleph. Technically speaking, something is not called nosar or pigol unless the blood sprinkling has been done already. We take a look at maybe before we look into anything, I want to point out that in explaining this Gemara and some of the subsequent proofs, you're going to see a machloikes in the Meforshim, in the commentaries. So we'll take a look at the Ran commentary, the upper part of the narrow lines of the Ran commentary. V'ho noisur pigol li'achar zrikas domimhu. Istelo garsi pigol. There are those that don't include pigol in the Gemara. Girsa sharei mikivan shnispagel ein zrikasu matiroso. This is Ron's pointing out something technical, and that is that once the zrika is done of a korban that you had a pigol mindset, so the zrika is not matirit. It doesn't allow the korban to be eaten. The question or the point of the Gemara here is drawn from the case of nosar, the iser nidre poka le bezrikas dam vafilu hachi tnan de oser almo beikoro kamatis. The nosar is leftover korban meat. At the point that the zrikas hadam, the sprinkling of the blood of that particular korban was done, so the zrika allowed the meat to be eaten. So the vow or prohibition aspect of it would be undone at the point that the sprinkling of the blood was done. So if the sprinkling of the blood allows the meat to be eaten, and the Mishnah is saying that if you compare the item that you want to prohibit to nosar and it's binding, it must be ikoro komatvis, that you're comparing your item to what's called the nosar meat in its original pre-blood sprinkling state. The Gemara responds and says, from the citation of nosar you cannot draw any conclusions. Amar le Rav Huna Braid Rav Nosan Benosa Shel Oila. The Mishnah is referring to someone comparing something to leftover olah, the leftover olah sacrifice. An olah sacrifice is also known as a burnt offering. There is no part of it that's ever allowed to be consumed. The Ran elaborates, and let's look at the Ran together. Even if you were to say that the person's intention is to compare the item to the korban and in its current state, akati nidre lo poka, there would be no undoing of the vow, because the ha'oilo asura filu lachar zrika. You might want to say in simple terms, with regard to the oilah, you don't have any change in the before and after. Before the zrika, it was forbidden, and after the zrika, it was forbidden. So, with that in mind, we understand if you say the Mishnah that said nosar is Ozer, it's because you're referring to the nosar of an olah. And since we're referring to the nosar of an olah, we can't resolve our question with regard to a person who had shlomim meat sitting in front of him after Zrika Saddam, because in the case of shlomim there is a difference between the before and after. Omar Lei. So he says back to Rav Huna, we can maybe assume that Rava who tried to conclude Rami Bar Chama's question from the Nosar citation, so Rav Huna rebuffed him. Nevertheless, Rava responds, says back, Omar Le'im Kain, Lisni Kibasar Olah. If the Mishnah, when it says Nosar, and the result of comparing the item upon which you want to impose the vow is a reference to you're comparing it to the nosar of olah, and olah has there is no difference between the before and after. So the Mishnah should have been more direct. It should have said kibasar olah, and it doesn't say that. It says nosar. Omar le Rav Huna responds and says lo mibaya komar. And what do we mean by that? Lo mibaya. I don't have to tell you basar olah the Ozer, the Abba Korban Komatvis. If I compare an item, a loaf of bread, to basar olah, of course, that's obvious that the vow takes place because you're comparing the loaf of bread to an actual sacrifice, and that's the paradigm of vow construction. However, nosar upigol itztaricha, the Mishnah's teaching of comparing an item to nosar and pigol needs to be taught. Salkadaita chamina, without that, I would have thought ka isur nosar ki isur pigol. I'm comparing the bread to the Torah prohibition of eating nosar, or the Torah prohibition of eating pigol. V'havele kematvis bedovar ha'oser v'lo mitzar. A person who would, let's say, be thinking in those terms, that would be comparing the item to something that's prior forbidden. We've spoken about this in the past. If a person were to say has an intention of making a vow of prohibition, he says, I want to compare this loaf, in other words, this loaf of bread is unto me like pig. Such a vow would not be binding, because in vow construction you have to compare the item which is the subject of the vow, to an item that you made forbidden, but not something that was pre-prohibited. Things like nosar and pickle, those are prohibited by the Torah. So such a vow wouldn't take place. Komash malon, therefore the Mishnah needs to teach the case of nosar, that when a person is comparing an item or imposing a vow of prohibition on an item and comparing it to nosar, he's not referring to the Torah prohibition of nosar, but he's referring to this specific piece of sacrificial meat that was left over. True, it experienced zrikas domim, but he is referring, in this particular case, as we said before, we're talking about nosar of olah, where there is no difference between before the zrika and after the zrika. Therefore, from here, you cannot draw any conclusions regarding the original question raised by Rami Bar Chama. His question focused on comparing the vow imposed item to basar shlomim. In the case of basar shlomim, there is a difference between it before the zrikas damim versus after the zrikas damim. So Mitzvah Hashem, in our next shiur, we'll have to pick up from this point, trying to conclude Rami Bar Chama's question. With that, we conclude our shiur for today.